Welcome to the Fictionary podcast, the show that helps you turn your words into bestsellers. I'm Shane Miller, Fictionary's Community and Customer Success Manager, and I'm here to help you structure stories readers can't resist. Enjoy the show. Hello, Fictionarians. Welcome to episode 6 of the Fictionary podcast. Today's show is all about how to write a fantasy novel. But first, I've got a quick update about what's happening at Fictionary this week. As always, it's exciting times at Fictionary HQ. It's all hands on deck as we prepare for our Writers' Conference, which is taking place between the 12th to the 14th of February 2023. The conference is online and it's free to our Fictionary community members. Why come along to the conference? Because of all of our fantastic guest speakers, of course. We've got folks from Writers House Literary Agency, Atticus, Draft to Digital, Rakuten Kobo, and more. The Rebel author, Sasha Black, is speaking. We have Fictionary certified story coach editors like me speaking, and it's going to be a lot of fun. You can still attend the conference for free by joining the Fictionary community, and the link is down in the show notes. Right, that's it for the update this week. Next, we have our voices from the Fictionary community segment, and then we'll dive right into this week's topic. This week's Voices of the Fictionary community quote comes from Cara Henderson. Cara says, "The joy of the community is the kindness. We encourage one another to build each other up." And that really is what we're all about in the Fictionary community. We want you to be the best writers and editors you can be. And the best way to do that is through interacting with each other, sharing ideas, and sharing knowledge. So thanks, Cara, not only for the testimonial, but also for being an integral part of the Fictionary community. Right, let's get into all things about how to write a fantasy novel. If you want to learn how to write a fantasy novel, then you, my friend, have come to the right place. But first, let's answer the crucial question, what exactly is a fantasy novel? Put simply, fantasy authors weave paranormal, magical, or supernatural elements into their stories, and most fantasy is inspired by well-known folklore, legends, and myths. And popular fantasy authors include Terry Brooks, V.E. Schwab, and Jim Butcher. As well as being a fantasy author and editor myself, I am a voracious fantasy fan. Books, TV shows, movies, games, everything from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Supernatural to the Furies of Calderon and Eragon, I will consume the lot. I love everything about this genre, and I can't wait to share my top tips with you. So are there major differences between fantasy and other genres? Well, surprisingly, there aren't as many as you might think, because like all great stories, fantasy tales, whether sprawling epics or contemporary page-turners, need compelling characters, powerful plots, and solid settings. So that's exactly the same as any other genre you might choose to write in. There are two key differences, though. The first is world building. As we all know, sci-fi and fantasy authors are the world-building heavyweights. I'm not saying world-building doesn't happen in other genres, but this is like a whole other level of world-building. So you need to bear this in mind when you're creating fantasy worlds that you want readers to explore. And the second crucial difference, of course, is magic systems. Making magic, the thing that gives fantasy authors sleepless nights. This is not for the faint-hearted. Now you know the differences and similarities between fantasy and some other genres, we're going to talk about how to actually write that fantasy novel. So how do you write a fantasy novel well? I've got 5 killer tips for you to help make this really easy. Tip number 1 is to know your subgenre. Writing fantasy fiction and fiction in general, let's be honest, is really hard. I don't say that to scare you. I only say it because it's true and I don't want to give you any false expectations. Why is it hard? Because there are so many subgenres, each with their own exacting tropes and conventions. Before we learn how to write a fantasy novel, let's look at some of these popular subgenres so that you have a working knowledge of what to look out for. And I will say this now, this list isn't exhaustive. If I provided you with a full list of fantasy subgenres, we would be here all week. And you don't have time for that, quite frankly. So the first subgenre that we're going to look at is dark fantasy. The defining characteristic that sets dark fantasy apart from other subgenres is its tone. This subgenre leans heavily on horror tropes to foster a gloomy atmosphere. The themes and plot lines explored are intended to create a feeling of dread for the reader. Examples include The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski and The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. Next up, we have high or epic fantasy, and as the name suggests, epic fantasy is most easily identified by its grand scale. It is epic, so here you will find sweeping landscapes, gargantuan secondary worlds, sprawling quests, and hefty page counts. Examples include The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks and The Magician's Guild by Trudy Canavan. Another subgenre of fantasy is paranormal romance. Shocking no one because there is romance in the title. The love story is the main plotline in a paranormal romance book. Usually magic or another supernatural force is the catalyst that brings the love interests together. And examples here include Blue Moon Eyes by Leah Copeland and Night Pleasures by Sherilyn Kenyon. Science fantasy is our next subgenre, and science fantasy has grown in popularity over recent years. As the name suggests, it's a blend of science fiction and fantasy, so a great mix of tech and magic that can lead to some great conflict. Examples include Herman Sternagel's Lies the Guardians Tell series and Julia Scott's Mirror Souls trilogy. And the fifth subgenre I want to look at is urban fantasy because it's my personal favourite. All you need is a modern-day city, a snarky protagonist, and a healthy dose of magic or the supernatural, and you're good to go. Examples include Stormfront by Jim Butcher and my own novel written as S.W. Miller, The Witch's Revenge. And my pro tip where subgenres are concerned is to read the bestsellers in your subgenre and study the tropes and conventions. This is the best way to write a great fantasy novel, and that's by understanding all the tropes and conventions in your subgenre, the things that readers expect to find in your stories. Okay, on to tip number 2. This is about bringing your magic to life. Magic, as we've discussed, is crucial in the fantasy genre, and you need to bring it to life for the reader. One of the easiest ways to do this is to describe how magic feels to your point of view character when they're using it. How, I hear you ask? Well, you use the senses, of course. So the senses include sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Those 5 senses that we use on a daily basis to navigate the world around us. So what does your point of view character see when they use magic? Hear, smell, taste, and touch when they use magic. I've seen some great examples of magic having a taste when characters use it, so you can really think outside the box and really bring your reader into that magical experience. My pro tip for bringing your magic to life is that when writing the senses, you need to be on the lookout for filtering and eliminate it. In case you don't know, filtering occurs when we use the sensory word saw, heard, smelled, tasted, touched, felt in a sentence, and filtering is detrimental because it places a little distance between the reader and the protagonist, and the reader remembers they're reading about someone else, which can pull them out of the story, and this means your novel loses some of its intimacy. So take the sentence, I heard an owl hoot in the distance, and compare it with an owl hooted in the distance. By removing the sensory word heard, you're not losing any meaning from the sentence, and the reader will feel as if that experience is happening to them. My third tip for writing a great fantasy novel is to follow your own rules. While we're on the subject of magic, magic systems all have rules, whether it's a hard magic system that is highly codified or a softer magic system that doesn't have as many rules, they will still be there in some shape or form. Otherwise, magic systems wouldn't be systematized at all. Now, once you've set a rule around your magic, it's a cardinal sin to break it. Let's look at an example of a magic system rule. In Helen Scheuer's Curse of the Siren Queen series, sirens possess a certain type of magic called a death song, and an amplified form of this magic known as the death chorus, but crucially, only female sirens can perform the death chorus. So what does this mean? Male sirens can't take part in a death chorus, so we wouldn't expect to see that happen in one of Scheuer's novels in this series. It's a rule that she's set, and she can't break it. So my pro tip for following the rules, and I know what you're going to say, you're going to tell me, Shane, all rules were made to be broken, right? Well, if you decide to break one of your own magic system rules, then you need to make sure you've got a really good reason for doing it. And whatever that reason is, it needs to be hinted at early on in the story and several times throughout. That way, the rule break won't come as a shock to the reader, but I do urge you to proceed with caution if you're thinking about breaking a magic system rule, because hardcore fantasy readers really don't like it when magic systems don't make sense. My fourth tip is to create a compelling protagonist. So many fantasy authors focus on plot when they write their novels, and I'm not saying that's wrong. As we all know, character, plot, and setting come in a balance. But I was guilty of focusing too much on plot myself before I learned more about the writing craft. The first set of questions I always used to ask myself were plot-based. So I would say, how can I hook my readers into my book? What's my inciting incident? How can I make plot point one, that point of no return, a better decision for the protagonist? And so on and so forth. But let me ask you a question. When you turn the final page of a book, what do you remember most? Is it the game-changing midpoint twist, the epic climax, or the satisfying resolution? Possibly, but I doubt it. I mean, do I remember every single plot point in a Harry Dresden novel, despite the fact that I've read them multiple times? No way, but I sure remember Dresden. That's right, it's the characters, specifically the protagonist, that keep your readers' story-hungry eyes glued to those pages. So, how do you create a compelling protagonist? The first thing you need to do is make them flawed, because flawed protagonists are relatable, nobody's perfect, and your main character is no different. The second thing is to give them a story goal. If your protagonist doesn't want anything, your story is going to be flat, it's going to be boring, but people who want things and chase after things are magnetic to your readers. And the third thing you need to do is make them change. We've got the external arc by giving them a story goal. We need an internal arc because great stories are about character transformation. And my pro tip for compelling characters, ensure you've introduced some aspect of your protagonist's flaw in the very first scene of your novel. Ideally, this should be done on the very first page if you can, because it's the easiest way to connect the reader and protagonist on an emotional level, because all humans are flawed. Being flawed is a universal experience, and that is what will bond your reader and protagonist together. And my final top tip for writing a great fantasy novel is to supercharge your fantasy villain. Don't underdevelop your antagonist. Just don't do it. Arguably, the villain is as important as the protagonist in your story, and they need to be a worthy foe. Remember, it's the villain that's driving your protagonist to change through the conflict that they create within the story. What we don't want for our fantasy villains are cardboard cutout, mustache twirling cliches with evil cackles. These villains read flat and one-dimensional, and what we do want a well-rounded antagonist with rational reasons for committing their dastardly deeds. Multi-dimensional villains are relatable. The reason for doing the things that they do is really key. One of my favorite supernatural villains of all time is Loki from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and other Norse mythology retellings. And why is this? Because there's a reason for the bad things that he does. He wants to prove himself to Odin, the man who raised him, and there's also his sibling rivalry with Thor. And these are such relatable concepts that readers can get behind. So my pro tip for supercharging your fantasy antagonist is to make the reader empathize with them. We almost want readers to support the villain, and if not support them, at least we want readers to understand their motivations. I'll leave you with my final thoughts on this. Like I said up top, Fantasy is a tough genre to write, but you can write a great fantasy novel by starting with these top 5 tips. There are a ton of balls to juggle, and most of the time it feels like you haven't got enough hands to keep up with what's going on. Hopefully, my top tips for writing a fantasy novel will make your job much easier. Once again, it's time for my favorite part of the show. That's right, it is question of the week. This week's question is kind of 3 questions in one, but here it is anyway. Are you writing a series? Which genre are you writing in? And how many books are you planning to write in that series? I can't wait to read your answers, and you can either leave a comment on the YouTube video or join the Fictionary community for free right now and have this discussion with a bunch of awesome writers and editors. The link to join the Fictionary community, as always, is down in the show notes. You've heard about joining the Fictionary community for the 2023 Writers' Conference this month, but did you know you can also attend free live talks with industry expert heavyweights all year round? Our next 5 guest speakers between February and April are best-selling romance author Delancey Stewart, Ellen Jovin from the Grammar Table, Jeff Elkins, also known as the Dialogue Doctor, best-selling thriller author Rio Ewers, and sensitivity reader Crystal Shelley. Join the Fictionary community for free and you get access to all these amazing people. Like I said, the link to join the community is down in the show notes. Thank you for listening to the Fictionary podcast. If you enjoyed the show, hit subscribe on YouTube or your favourite podcatcher. And don't forget to head over to the YouTube channel or join the Fictionary community for free today and answer the question of the week. Happy writing and editing, and we'll chat again next time.